Today's episode, we have a special guest, Stephen Buckbee, and he is a very key member of the Satir Global Network. So, Stephen, would you mind just doing an introduction of yourself, and then I'll lead us in a short, and then we'll start our conversation.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. My name's Steve. I come from a place called Escanaba, Michigan, which is in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, at the very top. And I'm a social worker and a licensed professional counselor. I taught at a small college for 25 years. Basically, I coordinated the human services program, taught sociology.
Mm-hmm.
I fell in love with Satir probably about 1985 after I saw her work in Chicago. And I have been a passionate fan since then. She was, in my mind, one of the best teachers I've ever experienced. So,
okay. Great. Okay, so that's a good introduction, and we're definitely going to get into. I'd like to hear more about your personal experiences with her, how she's been meaningful to you personally and professionally. And we're also going to talk about the Mandala today, which is a tool developed by Virginia, and which you've really taken on and I think developed in your own way and have created forms of it that I think are very useful for all kinds of practice, not just clinical therapy practice, from what I understand. And you've written a great article that I've had a chance to look at. So why don't we start with the Mandala itself and just taking a moment now to get into a meditative state. Let's just connect to our bodies right now. So that's one layer of the mandala, and just turning to our breath. And for the people listening, if you'd like to close your eyes, you can do that. And just beginning to turn towards the sensations of the body. Just feeling how your muscles feel. What is the tone like? Are you feeling any tension anywhere? Are you feeling relaxed and soft? And just using your breath as an anchor to center yourself as you look and attend to the various parts of the mandala. Just be aware of your physical posture right now as well. Just noticing, without needing to change anything, how upright or slouched is your body. Not judging anything, just observing. And next we'll attend to any kind of thoughts that are coming up, any kind of perceptions or judgments about anything. Just pay attention to any thoughts that are arising. Maybe they're thoughts about things that you need to do, people you need to connect to. Again, using the breath as an anchor, notice the thoughts and then return to your own core. Just noticing thoughts and letting them go. In the next layer, try to attend to any emotions, any feelings. Maybe they're associated to some of the thoughts or the physical sensations that you noticed. What are you feeling right now? And again, as you notice whatever you're feeling, don't go into the feelings, just observing them and returning to your breath as a way of grounding and centering yourself. Now just take a moment to notice your feet on the ground and the environment you're in. Maybe you're in your house, or maybe you're commuting. Just making note of the environment that surrounds your body as you're doing this practice. Maybe there are people around, coworkers or family, just making note of them. And that's the relational, the interactional space. And if it fits, maybe you can appreciate some of the people that provide support for you, that love you and care for you. And finally, as we're looking, just see if you can connect to yourself, this deep capital S self. Some might think of it as the spiritual core of themselves, the life force, the life that's pulsing through you, that's breathing through you. That has to do with your worth and value, that it doesn't have anything to do with a particular role, but just is. Virginia liked to call this the I am. And with all the different layers of you, just try to connect to that life that's inside of you and all around you. Breathing it in, sensing it, contacting it. Maybe even celebrating it. In a moment, we're going to transition it from the meditation, and I'd like you to come to your senses and feel, if your hands are together, to feel the sensation of touch, your hands together, or your hands on your lap, or your hands and arms on the chair, and slowly opening your eyes and feeling the sensation of sight as you're looking around you, whatever's in front of you, and maybe orienting your head and looking around and using your senses to orient you back and to ground you, using the sensation of sound also to ground you. And welcome back.
Thank you. It's very nice.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's a good way to start.
Yeah. The only part of the mandala that I skipped was the nutritional, and I didn't really know how to integrate it, and I also have questions about it for you. So maybe we could start off with the question of how's Virginia Satir's work influenced you, affected you personally and professionally? Could you start there, Stephen?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question yesterday. I started out as a social worker in a small town, and I started off in substance abuse, and then I moved to mental health services, mostly working with the police and jails. And then after that, I went to inpatient services, and all that time I'd been working with lots of different families, seriously dysfunctional. Mm-hmm. And I read everything that Satir had written. I was looking for something that would work, something that would, I looked for magic. I tried, there wasn't much out there in many ways for social workers and therapeutic tools.
What year time frame are you?
1973 I started.
Okay.
And so I was involved. I looked at everything there was. There was even transactional analysis, Gestalt therapy, mm-hmm. Rogerian. There was a whole bunch of different schools of thought, but everything I read about Satir I liked, because I like systems, and I liked the way she approached it. And so when I saw her in '85, it changed everything in some sense, because she was, in my mind, one of the most congruent people I'd ever seen. She knew her context when she was working. There were about 250 people in a hall. I saw her work with this family in a period of 45 minutes and basically used everybody in the audience to
Mm.
precipitate a change in awareness in this woman's son. And I thought it was genius. And so she put out a letter that said, can you, there's another training program, Crested Butte. So I joined her in that program in 1986. So I'd already started teaching at the college, but I was still doing a lot of clinical work. And I went out there and it spent 30 days and it was wonderful.
Stephen, I want to hear about these 30 days because I imagine they were incredibly impactful. I just want to make note that that initial thing, you used two words. One is congruent and the other is she made such use of the context. And what I'd like to understand is, are those things that stood out? Because you looked at a lot of different theories and a lot of different forms of practice. Of those, maybe those words are part of it, but what stood out, in your initial impressions of what you read and when you first saw her?
Oh, well, what stood out was she was very aware of what she was doing. She was not, first of all, she made contact with clients in ways that I've never seen therapists do contact. She made a contact that was very intimate with these people. There would be all kinds of people outside watching, but when she was working with somebody, she was working with just them. But she also knew how to use those people to, whether it was create a sculpt or whether it was to create an attitude in the room. And that was her awareness of the context. I can actually give you the story if you'd want to hear it. She was working with a family, and the family really wanted mom to be somebody else. They wanted her to be more connected to them, less judgmental of them, that kind of thing. And they were all very successful people who lived in the fast lane. Anyway, Virginia did this little piece and said to the mother, close your eyes for a moment, take a breath. What turns the lights on for you? And she started talking about her children in such a beautiful fashion. And she started to cry. And it was just beautiful. And then Virginia, in her way, said, now, would you open your eyes? And what's happening right now? And how do you feel? And the woman right to a kind of super reasonable place went, fine. Well, the whole audience at that time was kind of hoping that this mother would have had some major transformation. And Virginia said, let's take a break. But meanwhile, there was a buzz in the audience. And so she took a 15-minute break. We came back and the son came up who she was working with, and he was very agitated. And Virginia said to him, what's wrong with you? What's happening? And he said, those people out there, these are all therapists, psychotherapists and counselors, and they should know better. My mother's doing the best she can. And the lights went on. His lights went on. He says, that's exactly what I'm doing, isn't it? I'm putting this expectation on this woman, and that's who she is. I really have to accept her for who she is. So just to set that up, she used the whole audience.
So it seemed like she, in terms of when you described making contact, she made such an intimate connection with this woman. She was grounded and rooted in herself, and in that space, I can imagine that's what enabled her or empowered her to connect to this deep emotional place that allowed the tears to come, to express something that was so honest. How did she use safety? She built safety. How did she use the audience in that situation to help then the son to have the lights turn on for him?
Well, the son was reacting to the audience's expectations. He was aware that the audience was disgusted with her mother.
Because she went to this super reasonable place.
She went through this place, and the audience was hoping that she wouldn't come back to that super reasonable place.
Right.
And so that whole awareness created this amazing gestalt for this kid. And he went, my God, that's what I'm doing. I'm doing the same thing they did. Right. I'm judging her. I'm expecting her to change because I'm angry with her. That's insane.
Yeah. Wow.
I have to start accepting her for who she is. And that was the change. Yeah. Everything changed in the room. Everybody in the room became aware of the fact that, in fact, we had some pretty unrealistic expectations ourselves, both for Satir and for this person who she was.
Yeah, it's reminding me of that, the Bible story of the throwing of the stones.
Yes.
What you're describing, where it's, when Jesus says, okay, if anyone hasn't sinned, then you can throw the first stone. And it's like the son had that moment of like, they're all condemning her, but I understand that. Like I can understand, oh, I'm doing the exact same thing they're doing, this identification
Exactly.
of the pattern.
So
Yeah.
when I say I'm aware, she was aware of context. That's everything I saw her do in the short period of time I was with her, 2 years on and off, was she really knew how to use the resources that she had available, whether it was a blackboard or people. And when she talked to people, and you've seen her work, she made a connection physically with people. She often reached out, touched them, felt their hands, made contact with them. It was always amazing to watch her work.
It's that kind of thing just generally is pretty taboo, like therapists touching clients and touch in general in like educational systems. In the 70s, what was the temperature or was the culture around touch at that time? Was she breaking barriers with that kind of thing then,
She
or
was breaking all kinds of barriers, absolutely, no doubt about it.
yeah.
The interesting thing was she was doing things nobody had ever done before. She was actually working with whole family systems. She wasn't working with just a person about their dad or an individual in a setting. She would get into a room with 5 or 6 people, and she would actually begin to try to have people understand the perceptions of the other people in that system. She worked with, and the way she did it was she would innovate in ways that nobody had ever seen before. She would put people in positions or sculpts just to give people a picture of what was going on for them, so people could begin to share a common picture of their experience. None of
Hmm.
us all grow up in the same family. Everybody grows up, although we have the same people in our family, none of us grow up in the same family.
Right.
My first brother, John, is 12 years older than I am, right?
Hmm.
He grew up with my parents and they grew up with him. The next child was my sister. She was, 8 years younger than him. And then there was my twin and I. So,
Right.
and my parents grew up as I grew up, right? So what everybody, although we come from the same family, everybody has different experiences and perceptions of themselves in families.
Mm.
People often argue about how it was. Well, it's because they have different places and times in those
Yeah.
systems.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you talk about the context, um, I'm still learning a lot about that. Generally, from my understanding of the iceberg is a metaphor to describe the intrapsychic experience that people are having.
Yes.
And I've been starting to wonder if the context itself doesn't have its own iceberg, like if thinking about it as kind of an energy space, like it's the relational space between us. And for me, I've been challenging myself to update my own thinking about the iceberg, and if because Virginia said she transcended the specific, for example, the psychoanalytic um, sort of model of practice at the time in the 50s and 60s when she was coming up, and the thing you're describing, the way that she was able to play in the space between people and within people, it it transcends, I think, the limitations of language and the form of things, the patterns, in
Absolutely.
a way that I think even to this day, um, I I struggle to communicate about in terms of what differentiates Virginia, because it's like it's not the words, it's not the specific form, it's the spaces between the words and the energy, the intimacy, the contact that you're talking about, that physical contact, the contact made through the eyes and through the touch that I saw just through the videos. I didn't have the honor and privilege of meeting her, but could you could you speak to that a little bit more in terms of what what sort of inspired you or sprung inside of you when you saw her working that made you think there's something different going on here? Because that was my feeling just from reading about her and watching videos of her, that there was something very different and unique. Um,
Well, she did come out of this humanistic psychology thing. She really was, when she came out of Esalen, she
mhm,
brought with her a whole set of tools also that she came with that were about sculpting, creating the dynamic relationships. Um, that was also very new and not
mhm.
something that people did. She also talked to people. In therapy, historically, many people didn't get talked to. She responded right to people. She looked them in the face. She made contact with them.
I didn't quite understand that. She talked to people and
Well,
sorry, I
she
didn't.
she actually engaged them in conversation. She didn't say just how do you feel? How do you feel about that? She really took people down and paid attention to them all the time.
Mhm.
What differentiated her? Well, everything, her creativity.
Mhm.
Um, I remember talking, I put this up this morning. I don't know if you can see it on the wall here, hanging up there,
Yeah.
but that's
Yeah.
a mobile.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
she talked about families being like mobiles. So, so I made those. I make those for people to talk about how their systems work.
Mhm.
That's what she did. She would actually, and so what was unusual, first of all, is she actually gave people a framework and tools that they could use, number one.
Mhm. Mhm.
She gave her innovation around a teaching style. I get so excited when we talk about this. When the iceberg is an interesting idea, and you talk about context, for example. Context is there's an internal context and there's an external context, right?
Right.
You have inside and you have outside. When you look at the mandala or the idea of the mandala, it's a circle. There's an inside and there's an outside. So there's that connection. And that's
Mhm.
strange, but context is where you drift in life. It's where you are. It's space and time. And it never stays the same. It's
Mhm.
constantly changing. Constantly. Families don't change, stay the same because they're always changing. If one person's context changes, it impacts the whole system. So one of the amazing things about Satir was that awareness about context. Where did people come from? What are the rules they had in that context? If you look at every dimension of the mandala, and I give people these little things and I have them make their families,
Mm.
At what dimension did your parents connect? Was it the emotional dimension and physical dimension? What issues do they have around their interaction? Can they talk to each other? Do they have different rules?
Right.
So that's one of the things that I really liked about her is that she was a teacher first.
Mhm.
She
And it
was
sounds like there was a concreteness to the tools that she developed that wasn't really available in these other models and other therapy models.
absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I don't know anybody that was doing sculpting that was actually bringing families out of their chairs and having them move about and talk to each other in new ways, or have a woman stand on a step stool so she's for the first time in her life talking to her husband eye to eye. That's
Mhm.
pretty innovative. That's pretty courageous.
I wonder if we can transition into talking about the mandala because that might illustrate, it might further our conversation about what differentiated Virginia, and then touching upon the experiential parts of how she maybe introduced it to you and then how you use it. So could you introduce us to what the mandala is and the different components of it and how she used
Yeah,
it?
and I'll do it shortly. I have been known to do it for days. When you talk about it, the mandala, first of all, is like a belly button. That's how when I was sitting in the room, I remember where I was sitting. She talked about everybody in the world has a belly button. You have one, and I have one. And that's the first connection. That indicates our first being on our own. We're
Mm,
into the world. Everybody shares that experience. Okay, so she starts out with the idea of the universal. That's pretty courageous. At that time, when she was aware of the work of people like Margaret Mead were doing, and they were talking about universals. And many psychologists in the world believe there's no such thing as a universal.
mm,
Okay, so Satir said, yes, there are. There are human universals. Those are, and no matter what culture you go into, no matter where I am, I will probably be able to make a connection because there are some things that we all share. And so she said, we all share a spiritual connection. And from that, now we can go into all kinds of places. We can talk about the spiritual as a sacred and secular kind of thing. We can talk about it as a religion, or we can
mhm,
talk about it as life energy. It depends on where I am, what context. If I'm in China or other places, I might talk about it as a spiritual energy, life energy.
right, right.
What does spiritual mean? So, and there are rules that every family has also about that dimension. And so,
Mhm,
by the way, these are not really separate. They're all connected. So if you look at the core is the self, but around the self are these dimensions. I fell in love with it because I didn't see anybody developing it. And I thought it was such a powerful model that I remember really asserting my argument that it should be included in everything. But anyway,
Included in everything. What do you mean?
All the
Everything.
writings. We needed to write more about it. We needed to get
Okay.
it out there. We need to,
Within the satir trainings, within the satir
right,
community, that it needed to be highlighted
right.
is a powerful tool. I want to come back to this the theme of the universal, because what that resonates in me is this idea of universal wisdom. And I think she wasn't afraid to say what she thought was universally wise in a way of thinking about humanity, and putting sort of her stake in the ground and saying something like, we have eyes in the front, which means that we can only make contact with one person at a time. We're not like fish. We don't have eyes on the sides. So that connection and that contact needs to be very focused. And you describe that in the way with touch and making contact and the safety and the intimacy, that was a universal that she knew and believed in and embodied. So it seems that this, with the tool of the mandala, it spoke to many universal, that there's these layers, which I'd like you to describe in a little bit more detail, these layers that are universal, that are common across cultures. The form of these things, like spirituality, change, right? Like maybe in Asian cultures, it's Taoism, and in another culture, it might be Christianity. But the idea of spiritual level is universal. Could you describe a little bit more what the other layers of the mandala are
When you say that, I think you illustrate also the point is that the context, again, influences every one of the dimensions. So again, how you perceive, if I go to the Czech Republic, 80% of the people would call themselves atheists. If I cross the border 15 miles away, 80% of the people are Catholic. So the context obviously is going to determine how they're going to look at the spiritual or define spirituality.
Right.
Intellectual is also another dimension. That is, how do you take in information in the world? And how many kinds of intellect are there? People have a way of diminishing themselves by looking often at what they can't do rather than what they can do. So when I talk about intellect, I'm not talking about just being smart. It's also about talent, skills.
So not just IQ,
No,
but also, and from what I read from your article, you've referenced Howard Gardner's work on multiple intelligence, and the artistic and this kind of thing.
So when you and intellectual is also, it can certainly be an issue in families if you're interested in a particular idea that may not be allowed or tolerated. That intellectual pursuit may be thwarted. If you're smarter than your parents in a particular area, they may in fact feel inadequate towards you, which often happens actually. So you have that kind of issue. That's just a dimension. Every culture in the world has something about intellect. You have to learn, and you have to be able to survive and adapt. And that's part of the intellect, right?
Okay, so then beyond the intellect, what are the other?
The sensual is that's one of those things you're talking about. Is the senses is the ability to take in information. You don't put information out; you take it in, and you take it in through all five senses, right? Sight, and the amazing thing about this is touch, smell, all those things, hearing, taste. Everything that goes into the system, you have to make meaning about.
Yeah.
So that changes, that affects our perceptions, and that's connected with emotions and also about intellect. So again, you can see how the sensual piece is the feelers that we have in the world, how we take in information about the world through these things, and then how we make meaning about those things. For example, if you meet somebody you don't like and it's an immediate response, then obviously it's a historical recall, right? It's a pattern has been recognized.
Right.
Virginia, you call them hats. So then you have to say to yourself, well, who does this person remind me of? And take that hat off of them. Senses are powerful. How many ways can your mother say your voice, your name? So when you,
there's few ways,
very powerful.
Yeah. So it seems that by differentiating the different layers of the mandala between the sensual, and I know that this was something that she articulated so well, which is what did you see and hear, separate to what meaning did you make, right? And so the meaning that you make, the meaning, is that in the intellectual realm of the mandala, or where would you put that?
It's at both. So both intellectual and emotional. And I think this is really a very important thing that sometimes we don't talk about, but that is that feelings are not the same as emotions. Emotions are hardwired. Feelings are the experiences we have about that emotion, right? First, you have so the sensual piece triggers an emotional response, and then a feeling about that. Fear, for example. How do I feel about fear? So that there is an amazing piece about emotions. Emotions are also, when I get that trigger, I also use the patterns I've had in the past. I have a feeling of whatever it is, inadequacy, but feelings and emotions are triggered by this sensual piece.
Okay, so now we're into a different layer, the emotional layer, and you're making this distinction between emotions and feelings. So you're defining emotions as the as sort of the below the cortex, the fear, the sadness, the anger, like those kinds of those base
right,
level emotions.
Right, for the physiology.
In the physiology that are part of the mammalian brain, the reptilian brain, and then you're talking about feelings about those feelings. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. And that's the more sophisticated layer. And does that then get into rules about feelings?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. For example, let's say it's a gender-based issue and you're angry, but girls aren't supposed to get angry. So what do you do with the anger? It changes how you do things, right? If you have a rule about that, how you can interact, because that's one of the dimensions is interaction,
Okay.
right? So how things get expressed, it depends upon the context that we're in and the rules that are surrounding us.
Right. So a person could feel shame about feeling anger. Sorry?
I'm sorry, good boys don't cry.
Okay. Yeah. So then they feel shame if they cry.
So there you go.
Yeah. So then
And
that's the
then,
feeling.
so the next thing is, what do they teach their son about that?
Right.
And how do they teach them that?
Right. And then that's the intergenerational pattern that gets passed on.
Right. So the next one I think is that gets a lot of confusion is the nutritional piece.
Yes, I wanted to I wanted to learn about that one with you.
Well, if you look at the mandala, and you look at the 8 dimensions, every dimension has to be fed. Just think about, some people look at, when you look at the Satir model or the another new book that just came out, they kind of talk about the nutritional piece as just eating, taking in nutrition. Though it's very important, that's not what it's just about. It's also about drug addiction, alcoholism, right? It's about overeating. Nutrition is, how do you feed each dimension? How do you feed your spiritual piece? How do we take time every day? Do we take time to meditate, to realize that we have amazing selves? Not very often. So how do we feel? How do we nurture and feed our intellectual piece? How do we feed our spiritual piece? How do we feed?
That's really interesting, Stephen, because you just used the word, and when you were defining it, like nutritional, you're defining it as nurturing. The act of nurturing across dimensions. How are you nurturing these different layers of yourself, your emotional self, your interactional self, your spiritual self? How are you nurturing that? Sure. So it's more a principle than the concreteness about like what's going into your mouth.
It's more than that. You have to listen. One of the hardest things as a social worker early on, I learned, and you probably met children too, but these are failure to thrive babies. Babies weren't held because moms didn't know how or whatever. And what's really amazing to me is how fast they respond to connection, how they will actually begin to thrive. And what you're doing is you're not just giving them the milk or the food. What you're giving them is the love. You're giving them some energy. How fast people heal often is related to what kind of support systems they have. So I think about nutrition as taking in things, taking in new information at the intellectual level. Things that, if you're going to be looking at geriatrics, for example, one of the best things to do, right, is to stay active and to stimulate your brain. So that's a nutritional piece. How do you feed your brain? How do you feed your emotions? In my life, I've had clients that I say to them, you have to learn to play. You have to go play. They don't know because they've gotten so lost in their business or their support issues or whatever they are. How do you take care of that piece?
This is interesting, Stephen. The way that you're describing nutritional is so different than any way I've heard it described before. Because generally, I remember Virginia said something like, the context sets the content that allows for the change to happen. right? So when we're in a particular context, it allows us to give us a form of what we're talking about, but the process is the primary thing, right? So whether we're talking about, okay, I want to change my diet or I want to communicate better, the specific content piece around, like maybe you're talking about how chores are divided up. That sets the sort of the chessboard of which you're playing, but
Mhm.
the process of engagement, of making contact, of having the freedom to comment, the freedom to feel, the process that undergirds all of that, that's where the magic is. And when you're talking about this concept of how nurturing, it's like nurturing is a principle that we need to keep in mind across all of the different layers of the mandala. It almost sounds,
Absolutely.
it sounds like you're defining it almost in a meta way that actually transcends or needs to be incorporated in each of the different levels of the mandala.
Let's see, I see them all as connected.
hmm Okay.
See, and I think, for example, when you tell people get more healthy, when you talk about people changing patterns, what you're doing is teaching them how to feed themselves in a new way, in a different way. You're teaching them physical changes. You're teaching them emotional changes. You're definitely teaching them intellectual, to be cognitively aware of
Uh,
things. So you're in fact feeding each of those dimensions. Think about information as food. It's
ah, that is so cool, Stephen. This is really, yeah, this is really ex helping me expand because, yeah, because that's the systemic nature of how Virginia worked, that these layers, and she used to use this metaphor of a soup.
yep,
You're putting each ingredient in, and when they're combined together, like they form something that couldn't be formed in and of themselves. So
that's right.
the principle of nurturance, of like you're describing, taking new things in, adds something to thinking about the principle of interaction. How
Right.
are we thinking about relationship? How are we treating or relating to emotions and that other layer of ourselves, and then the spiritual.
Absolutely.
Um,
Which reminds me of one of the things she used to say: if this doesn't fit for you, throw it out. Take it in, and try it on, and throw it out.
mhm.
The process of change, right? There's an integration. If you take something in and it doesn't work, get rid of it, expel it. It's part of the system.
Right, right.
So
Okay.
anyway,
What else? I
well,
think
there's interaction, and there's
yeah.
the idea of how you talk to yourself and how you talk to other people. So
Mhm.
you talk to yourself. One of the things we deal with as therapists is how to help people change their internal dialogues, right? How to
Right.
become aware of particular kinds of patterns, and then also how do they talk to other people? And those are often based upon family systems rules and family system patterns. So although people say, I'll never do what my parents did, oftentimes they say exactly what they did because that's what they know how to do, right?
Mhm, mhm. So does that get into when you're talking about the interactional, is this a good place to talk about the survival coping stances of blaming,
Absolutely.
placating, super reasonable, and irrelevance?
Well,
Um,
yes.
yeah.
But I also say this: every one of these dimensions that we talk about is on the mandala, you are vulnerable about. We have vulnerabilities around every one of these dimensions. And so
Uh-huh.
when those vulnerabilities are triggered, that's when we kick in our defenses. That's when we use our coping stances. For example, when I'm feeling intellectually challenged, I can tell you exactly what I do. I often become irrelevant. I distract you so fast you won't even know what happened. We'll be
hmm
having a good time, but the conversation has changed completely.
Right.
So I will become irrelevant. So that's a pattern that I will use. So we will use these stances around every one of these dimensions.
Right. Right. And the way you defined it initially, you said how you talk to yourself and other people, how that dialogue is happening. I also, when you use the word talk, I also thought of the word treat, how you treat yourself and other people.
That's right.
Is that a
Absolutely.
way of thinking about it? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then the
Um,
last two are the context we've talked about and the physical dimension, which I'm sure you know a lot about. But the physical dimension is really the container that you call by your name,
right.
and all the things that we do to it to gain acceptance or how people put. Again, there's so much context related to this one too. What's attractive in one culture? I used to, in my sociology class, take the mandala, list the 8 dimensions, and then have them talk about how they might be different in, say, Mexico than in South Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
Might be the differences around each one of these dimensions.
Yeah, when you use the word container, I've been thinking about that word container and containment a lot. There's the child psychiatrist Donald Winnicott that talked about a holding environment. And when you're talking about children that struggle to thrive, the need to be held, how important that is. And I think about the physical realm, in the practices that I've looked at, physical practices, I think there's an embodiment, there's an expression of the physical that when we move, when we dance, when we work out, when we do yoga, when we walk in nature, there's a physical connection to the inside and the outside that creates a space and a containing space then to hold a variety of. Yeah, so we're just talking about the physical, and your use of the word container makes me think of just how powerful it is when we get grounded in our body and we move or we go for a walk, that we are then able to contain and hold and look at our experience or nurture them, as you were talking about earlier. Okay, so anything else you want to say about the physical?
No, I mean, there's a lot to talk about. One of the things that's amazing to me is how the body talks to people.
Mm-hmm.
And how people tend to just ignore it until it talks to us to a point where we really have to pay attention.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. The physical part is what a lot of people believe, this, especially the kids that I've met historically, is that this is often so difficult for them because they don't know about the other parts. This is the part they're most aware of. This is the part, that is very difficult between the ages of 13 and 25, this adolescence and becoming an adult. And a lot of it focuses on this physical dimension.
Mm-hmm. Attractiveness, sexuality,
that stuff. So it's a
yeah.
loaded issue. It's a very powerful issue. I'm always amazed how people, what amazes me is how people can adapt as well around this physical dimension. I had the honor for a while of working with people that had amputations of their legs.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting to me is how well they adapted and changed in responses to things like trauma. And how some people did so well and some people didn't. Yeah. And they had to do a lot with perceptions of self.
Yeah, one of the things as we're talking and going through the different layers or different aspects or arms of the mandala is when we were just talking about teenagers and maybe when they're dealing with insecurity around their body and attractiveness, that I think, you in the way that you could use this tool, it sort of fleshes out that there's much more to you than the physical. And if you bring in the intellectual, the emotional, the interactional, the nutritional, when you bring in these other components, then you're talking about wholeness. And wholeness to me is one of those universals that Virginia kept working towards, no matter what the symptom was. Can you speak to that, this theme of wholeness and how the mandala helps people experience that and engage?
Let me tell you two stories. Well, first one is I have a worksheet. I'll send it to you, and that you can use. But it's a wonderful worksheet, and we use it with kids. A lot of my friends use it with their kids, and it's basically an inventory of self using each one of the dimensions. And what you have them do is you have people write down, can you give yourself an appreciation of each one of these dimensions? And you'll find that there's a dimension they get to and they go, ugh.
Right.
It's not something, and so that's where really then maybe want to pay attention to or talk about what are the issues that you get stuck on. So, doing an inventory of self is kind of interesting, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the way to almost assess or check out each of these layers is, can you appreciate it?
Can you appreciate it?
That's neat. Yeah.
Can you go back and repeat the first part of that question?
Yeah, no, it seems like, when you're going through the layers of the mandala, one way to check out where maybe there's a hook or there's a trigger point for people is asking them to try to appreciate it.
Oh,
because if they can appreciate it, the energy can flow, the communication can flow about it. But if not, then okay, that's an area where there may be some trauma or a barrier or a rule around it that's preventing.
Right, and that's when you can go to work. I often, when I'm doing a workshop, I'll take a person, for a volunteer, and then what we'll do is we'll walk them around their parts. And I'll have them pick out one person in the audience to represent their physical part, one person to represent their spiritual part. So pretty soon they're surrounded by these parts. And then I want them to turn around to each part and say, tell them what you appreciate about them.
Right.
And as they go around, it's often very powerful. And they get to this one part and they go, oh. And then they say, okay, what do you need? What part, if you look around, what part can help you with this?
Nice. Yeah.
So you bring that part over and you stand next to that other dimension and say, what do you need to tell this person? Or what do you need to tell yourself about this piece? What
Beautiful.
do you say?
Yeah.
And so what you can do then is begin to find out, because it's right, eventually we all do our own problem solving.
Yeah.
And my favorite line of all times, and I really believe this, is that therapy isn't something you do to anybody, it's something you do with them.
Yeah.
Right. And so what you're wanting to do is you want to empower them as much as you can to realize that they have these resources and that they can make a connection with those resources. And so that's one of the ways I do that is I have them it's called a walk around the mandala. And it's just beautiful.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. I can just imagine that.
Reading, yeah. If you remember the temperature reading,
yeah.
What are the appreciations? What parts puzzle you the most? What parts, so there's that whole kind of idea of taking a look at it in an iceberg. Every dimension of the iceberg, if you take a dimension of the mandala and take the iceberg and put them next to each other, every dimension of the mandala has an iceberg.
Okay, so
try that on.
yeah. No, I will. I guess I want to come back to your use of the word resourcing or resources, because I was doing a training with Maria Gamori a few years ago, and we were talking about resources, and I think we were talking about the mandala actually, but then other kinds of resources as well. And I asked her for a definition. I said, how do you define resources? Because it seemed like so many different things could be a resource. And she answered, I don't really remember what she said, but I thought about it a little bit more. And I thought of the therapy process as resourcing. That, for example, reframing is taking something that maybe was a negative and turning it into something that was useful, that you could use as a resource. And when you're describing the way that you use the mandala, it's like, okay, what's the resource? The part of you that's maybe a bit far, that's a bit disavowed at this point. How can we change the interactional pattern there, bring it in, so then it's a resource rather than something that is in the corner, shamed about or something like that. I really love that that picture, because it honors the multi-dimensions, the multi-layers of us. And I think it speaks to the empowering way that Virginia worked, and the emphasis that you're describing on that we need to entrust and empower rather than to do for, because there's really that doesn't work.
No. It's when people become aware of things. One of the greatest things for me for teaching freshmen in college was watching them have their lights come on. People that I worked in a small community college where people were often taught that they couldn't go on or they didn't have the ability. And all of a sudden they find out that they have the resources, that they have the ability. And once they tap that, they just turn on. Virginia was all about turning on people's lights. She was really all about people trying to, when she asked me to join Avanta the last year, her goal was to take people and have those people advance her work, not just to repeat her work, but to say, how can we use sculpting in a new way or more powerful way? How can we use the iceberg, and what are the various contexts? So to go back to the original question, when I fell in love with the mandala, we were teaching children, working with people who were working with children in secure and non-secure holding facilities. These were children that were being locked up in adult jails, and as a result of that, suffered greatly because there wasn't any sound separation, and bad things often happen to young people in jails. So there was this idea of trying to create separation, and one of them was looking at alternatives to incarceration. So we used the mandala for 2 days to take a look at who are these children that you'd be working with? So we looked at their family systems. What are the various things you're going to encounter? What to do, what not to do. If you're a Baptist minister and you want to help these kids, this is not the context to to evangelize. This is
Right.
a time to be with them and comfort them. So you have to address all the rules, the spiritual issues, the intellectual issues. Here, some of these kids are very, very smart. So you use the mandala to teach the groups that's going to be working with him to make them more sensitive to these people, to see that they also have the same dimensions. See, that's the hook. If the people that are working with it can identify and realize that, I have the same one, I have these same things, they might be more sensitive to how they work with these kids. And we found it to work very well.
Yeah.
If you look at the process of change, which is one of my favorite models that Satir has, and you put a mandala first, and then you look at the foreign element. The foreign element comes in at one of those dimensions for all of us. People can have a spiritual crisis. People can have an intellectual crisis. If you work with a traumatic brain injury, you realize that there's a physical, intellectual, emotional problem going on instantly, right?
Right.
So these are the kinds of things that I think I think the mandala is also very good for helping do assessments.
Yeah, I want to come back to what you're describing with working with those kids who I imagine because of whatever trouble or neglectful kind of environments they're in, they may have they likely engaged in negative behavior, destructive behavior, and I think the mandala and the various tools that Virginia created helped people transcend looking at behavior alone and looking at the whole person, looking at them as people of worth that had the capacity for growth and the capacity for connection. That's and right. That the things that we saw on the superficial layer represented the best learning and the best survival coping that they could come up with at that time. And that goes back generations, and the appreciation of that. And yeah, and I think, bringing and integrating what I appreciate, I think, so much about what you've done is integrating the different tools that Virginia created and finding the relationships between them, the process of change, and how that integrates with these various layers of the mandala, or various branches of it. Can we shift gears a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I guess the two other questions I wanted to make sure we covered is what are your hopes for the future direction of Virginia's work? We're talking about the mandala. Maybe it has to do with that, or maybe it's something more generally. I've been in practice now 11 years. And as I was doing my training, I felt like there was not much exposure or learning about Virginia's work. So, and what she has to offer, I think, is so powerful and useful. Could you speak to that, sort of in your experience from 1973 till now? What's your hope for the future? Yeah.
I really have a hope and wish that, when Virginia died, there was quite a bit of chaos about how do we advance the foundation. And since 1988, literally the global network has struggled to find its mission, which was basically to advance the work of Virginia. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're on the right track now. We're starting to create some online classes. But the hope and wish is that we begin to teach it in curriculums in colleges. Mm-hmm. It's really interesting going to the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and in China, they've all got some curriculum or courses on Virginia Satir. Everybody seems to know about her. Come to the States, nobody knows about her.
Right.
And I think it largely had to do because she was a woman and she was a social worker. And so everybody calls her a psychologist because she got an honorary doctorate. But she was a social worker who was a very bright woman who knew how to surround herself with people that would help her advance her work.
Yeah.
That's what she really wanted. And so my hope and wish is that it enters into college classrooms, that social workers begin to find out that one of the greatest social workers in the history of the United States was a woman named Virginia Satir from northern Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. That's what I want. I mean, I really believe that she had, a lot of the stuff I learned in college I couldn't use. It was really good theoretically.
Yeah.
and sounded great, but I didn't know how to incorporate it. When I met Virginia Satir, she actually said, there are some tools. And what I want to do is, everybody thought, well, that's Virginia. Only Virginia could do that. And Virginia knew that that wasn't true, that she really did have a formula that she was trying to teach. But sadly enough, she died before that was fully articulated.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so what I want was I would seriously love to see more integration into the social work field itself, more people becoming aware of who she is, and I would like to see more of it brought into colleges and universities.
Yeah. And I think I would add, and I know there's people in the satire community that also want to emphasize it in public education, because I think
Absolutely.
one of the things that differentiates her from other theories is it's so experiential, because what she was teaching is um, how to be fully human,
Uh,
how to make use of yourself, how, like you're describing with the mandala, what are the dimensions of yourself that you could explore and enrich and live through and express. And yeah, I think that it's an education that, there's content pieces like arithmetic and writing, and then there's processes of how do I get in touch with my inner world? How do I express that? How do I comment on things that I see, aware of these cultural and family rules, so that I'm empowered, that I'm not just in a certain pattern or programming, but I can be empowered with my awareness to then make choices. She talked a lot about becoming your own choice maker. And these things, a lot of therapeutic systems focus on symptom reduction, but she transcended all of that. And I think she even said she doesn't spend much time with symptoms, because what she's focused on is health. And this is before the positive psychology movement, the idea of wellness, and what is the highest expressions of a human being. And
which is well said, by the way.
thank you. Yeah. Um, uh, I hope we can collaborate more on that idea of integrating these kinds of learnings, because they're universal. They're not, I mean, her ability to be physically present, her ability to communicate are uniquely her talents, but the model and the ways of thinking about what it means to be human, how we can improve our communication, they're skills. They're skills that
I,
could be learned.
I
And
probably 80% of the work I do is not with therapists or teaching therapists. It's mostly working with hospitals, small businesses, around leadership issues, or working with clients that may be angry or dangerous or that kind of thing.
mhm,
But it's really about most of the stuff is how do you use these models to teach general populations,
mhm.
leadership programs, for example, programs about suicide, all actually are. So it's a general. Excuse me. What I'm trying to say is that this model is really something that most laymen can understand and get their hands on
Yeah,
and use.
yeah,
It's not
yeah.
psychobabble.
Yeah, and it transcends disciplines. I've heard people in engineering or computer science using her model, and it can kind of go in all sorts of different directions. Stephen, just as I'm feeling kind of that maybe we could start to round out now, and this has been a wonderful experience with you. I wanted to connect with you and reflect on, what this conversation's been like for you, to reflect on Virginia, to reflect on your own work and your own learning process. Can you share just in this moment something of your own experience right now?
Well, I'll tell you when I feel it when I talk to you, Tim, is hopeful. um, this experience has been very good. I find myself often looking for audiences to share my ideas about the mandala. Um, so I really I've enjoyed this conversation.
Great, great. And have you created an online course for the mandala yet?
No, we've included it in the Secure Foundation's online class, but no, but that's really something I need to work on.
Okay, yeah. So I'd love to, encourage you to and support you in that in any way that I can. I think that's something that needs to happen, in creating a tool, an online resource, and then also, if there's different workshops and things like that, then that we can learn about, then Yeah, I'd love to
Well, I
learn
hope I
more from
see you
you.
in the fall.
Yeah.
We're doing a workshop with a local hospital on how to use the mandala, working with generational issues.
Okay.
So that should be an interesting experiment.
Right. Okay. Any final things that you'd like to share about yourself, about your work? Any final
No, I'd like to
messages?
invite anybody who's listening to join us on Facebook and visit our website. If you're looking for material about Virginia Satir, there's a number of links. There's including videos on the website and other.
Okay.
So I would encourage us to visit the
Okay.
site.
Yeah, I'll share links to those to the Satir Global Network and then the Facebook page. You'd like me to share that as well, so I'll do that. Thank you, Stephen. We're at exactly an hour now, an hour and 45 seconds. I've really enjoyed our conversation and I've learned so much.
Thank you so
So
much. I did too. I really enjoyed being with you. I was very nervous about it.
no.